There are investigators who work with evidence. There are detectives who work with witnesses. And then there are those who work with something else entirely, something that cannot be photographed, filed, or cross-examined in a courtroom. In April of 1994, when the world was still reeling from the news coming out of Seattle, a different kind of inquiry had already begun. Not in the hallways of the Seattle Police Department, not in the offices of Rolling Stone, but in the silence that follows a tragedy, that thick, heavy silence that settles over a place where something irreversible has happened. What a medium senses in that silence is not evidence in any legal sense, but it is, for those who take it seriously, a form of testimony. And what several sensitives would later describe about the greenhouse at Lake Washington, about the final hours of Kurt Cobain, paints a portrait that forensic records alone have never been able to complete. The greenhouse. It sat above the garage of the Lake Washington home, a modest structure by the standards of a man worth millions. Dark wood, old glass panes, the kind of space that absorbs whatever happens inside it, the way old houses absorb decades of argument and laughter and grief. By April 1994, that greenhouse had witnessed something it would not release easily. Mediums and psychics who later worked with investigators and journalists independently, without coordinating their accounts, described the same sensation upon approaching that structure. A weight, not physical, but atmospheric, the feeling that the air itself remembered something it was not ready to let go of. One described it as walking into the emotional residue of a man who had been saying goodbye for a very long time, not in hours but in years. What they sensed in those final days. This is where the metaphysical account diverges most sharply from the official record and where it becomes most compelling. The physical evidence speaks of a single night, a single act, a defined moment. But those who work with energetic impressions describe something more prolonged, a slow dissolution that had been accelerating for months. Several independent sensitives, when asked to focus on Kurt's final week without being given specific details, returned with variations of the same image, a man sitting alone, not in despair exactly, but in a state of profound exhaustion. Not the exhaustion of someone who has worked too hard, the exhaustion of someone who has been carrying something that no one else could see, for so long that the carrying itself had become the only thing he knew how to do. The chronic pain that had defined his adult life, that relentless gastric agony that doctors had failed to diagnose for nearly a decade, was not merely physical in the reading of those sensitives. It had become, in their language, part of his energetic signature, inseparable from how he experienced every moment of being alive. The fractured energy of that room. There is a concept in mediumistic work that some call residual haunting, the idea that intense emotional events leave impressions in the physical spaces where they occur, replaying without intelligence, like grooves worn into stone. What was described about the Lake Washington greenhouse was not this. What multiple sensitives described was something more active, more present, the impression of a mind still working, still composing. The image of hands, Kurt's hands, recognizable in the calloused, slightly crooked way of someone who had played guitar since childhood, moving through the air as though still reaching for something that kept moving away. One medium, working from a photograph of the greenhouse taken after the investigation, described a sensation of incomplete sentences, the feeling that something had been left unsaid, not in the note found beside him, but in a deeper register, something he had been trying to articulate for years and had never found the language for. The note and what surrounds it. The suicide note that Kurt left behind addressed his audience more than it addressed his family. It spoke of his fans, his inability to feel the passion he once had, his exhaustion with the performance of enthusiasm. It invoked Neil Young, "It's better to burn out than to fade away," in a way that suggested he had been thinking about those words for a long time, turning them over, testing them against his own experience. What mediums who focused on the energy of those final hours described goes beyond the words on that page. They described the sensation of a man who felt that he was already gone, that the version of himself the world was mourning had departed some time before his body followed. The Kurt Cobain of magazine covers, of screaming crowds, of MTV speculation and tabloid headlines, that person had felt like a stranger to him for years. What remained in his own experience of himself was something quieter, something that had existed before Nevermind, before Teen Spirit, before the machinery of fame had taken his face and built something he didn't recognize around it. The isolation that preceded everything. March of 1994 had been a month of escalating silence. After the incident in Rome, that night at the Excelsior Hotel, that the official accounts called an accidental overdose, that those closer to the situation described with more complicated language, Kurt had returned to Seattle in a state that those around him found difficult to read. He was calm in a way that worried people. Not the agitated, volatile calm of someone suppressing rage, but something more settled. Those who work with energetic impressions and who focused on the period between his return from Rome and the first days of April described this quality as a kind of decision energy, the particular stillness that surrounds someone who has resolved something internally, even if that resolution is a terrible one. The rehab attempt in late March, the departure from the facility in Los Angeles, the flight back to Seattle, each of these movements carried, in the mediumistic account, the quality of someone retracing steps they had already decided would be their last. Francis Bean, and What Love Looks Like in Residual Impression. Among the most striking elements of the metaphysical accounts gathered in the years since 1994 is the consistency with which Francis Bean appears in descriptions of Kurt's final energetic state. His daughter was 20 months old. She would grow up without a memory of him that she could consciously access. And yet multiple sensitives, working independently, described a strong, clear thread of connection in the energy surrounding those final hours, a brightness that stood in contrast to everything else. The image of her face in the mediumistic reading was not a source of resolution for him, it was a source of anguish, precisely because of its clarity. He could feel her, in whatever way a father feels his child's existence, and that feeling did not make the decision easier, it made it more terrible. This is not the portrait of a man who had forgotten what he was leaving behind. It is the portrait of a man who knew exactly what he was leaving, and whose pain had grown so large that even this knowledge was not enough to hold him here. The greenhouse after. When investigators entered the space, they were working within a framework of physical evidence, what could be seen, measured, catalogued, but those who entered that space later, with different instruments and different frameworks, described something the photographs and reports could not capture. The atmosphere of a decision made in absolute solitude, not the solitude of abandonment. Kurt had not been left alone by people who didn't care. He had been alone in the particular way of someone whose internal landscape had become inaccessible to everyone around him, including those who loved him most. The greenhouse, in the mediumistic account, held the impression of that final solitude like a vessel holds water. The wood, the glass, the old structure of a modest room above a garage, all of it saturated with the emotional weight of a man who had arrived at what he believed was the end of a very long road. What this kind of investigation offers, it would be easy to dismiss the metaphysical account entirely, to say that what mediums describe is projection, pattern matching, the human mind's compulsive tendency to build narrative from nothing. That is a legitimate position. But it is worth noting that the emotional truths described by those who have worked psychically with the events of April 1994, the exhaustion, the chronic pain as more than physical, the decision energy of those final weeks, the terrible clarity of his love for his daughter, are consistent with what the documentary and forensic record also shows, approached from a completely different direction. The convergence is, at minimum, thought-provoking. At maximum, it suggests that Kurt Cobain's final hours contained dimensions that the official record, by definition, could not fully capture. The silence that remains. 30 years have passed since the morning of April 8, 1994, when an electrician arrived at the Lake Washington house to complete a job and instead found something that would stop time for a generation. The greenhouse still stands, in some form. The house has changed hands. The neighborhood has absorbed the event the way neighborhoods absorb everything, slowly, incompletely, never entirely. Those who work with what remains after tragedy, the energetic residue, the emotional impressions, the metaphysical after-image of an irreversible act, describe Lake Washington as a place that has not finished processing what happened there. Whether one takes that literally or as a poetic description of collective grief, it speaks to something true about Kurt Cobain's death and its aftermath. The world has not finished processing it either. 30 years of documentaries, biographies, investigations and tributes have not resolved the central question that everyone who loved his music carries: what was lost, and whether it had to be lost, and what might have been different if the pain had found another door. What a medium actually saw. In the end, what the psychic account offers is not an answer. It offers a texture. It fills in the silence between the facts with something that resembles emotional truth: the quality of his isolation, the shape of his exhaustion, the terrible brightness of his love for his daughter against the darkness of everything else. Whether that texture is literally the residue of his final hours, or whether it is the collective empathic imagination of people who loved his music and feel his loss still, is a question that cannot be settled. What can be said is that the image it creates is consistent and deeply human and worth sitting with. Kurt Cobain was a man who lived inside his pain in a way that most people never have to. He was also a man who made music that made other people feel less alone in theirs. That exchange, his pain for our recognition, defined his life and his legacy. The greenhouse at Lake Washington was where it ended, but the music and the question of what it meant and what it cost has never stopped. If you or someone you know is struggling with mental health or thoughts of suicide, please reach out. In the US, 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. Call or text 988. You are not alone. Help exists.